Hello, family of the channel. What I'm going to tell you today changed my life forever, and I need to share it because I know many of you have gone through something similar. Today, you're going to see how I managed to get my revenge in the best way possible. You'll discover how a man who buried me alive, thinking he had silenced me forever, was utterly destroyed by nothing more than a simple wooden rosary. His empire, built on lies and intimidation, crumbled in a single moment of divine justice, all because he underestimated the power of faith and the truth it illuminates. My name is Mateo. I am 45 years old, and for most of my life I have been the priest at the church in Santa Esperanza, a small, devout town I love with all my heart. My story is one of betrayal, and a miracle that gave me the strength to fight back against pure evil. Listen to my story to the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? The source of my suffering was a man named Ricardo Vargas. To the outside world, he was a charismatic and pious land developer, a benefactor who promised progress and prosperity. But I, and the poor farmers he was trying to displace, knew the truth. He was a corrupt tyrant, determined to illegally seize our community's land to build a luxury resort for the rich, and he would let nothing and no one stand in his way. Before Vargas arrived, my life was simple and filled with purpose. I celebrated baptisms, officiated weddings, and offered comfort during funerals. I wasn't a hero or a fighter. I was just a servant of God trying to guide my flock. My greatest joy was working with the poor, ensuring they had a voice. But when Vargas began his campaign of threats and fraudulent claims, I knew my faith demanded more than just prayers. It demanded action. I became the main obstacle to his plans. Using the church's old, dusty land deeds, I organized the local farmers and began to challenge his claims in court. I knew it was dangerous, but I believed the law and God were on our side. After a particularly tense town meeting where I exposed some of his lies, I could see the hatred in his eyes. He realized that as long as I was there, the people's spirit would not break. That very night, his henchmen ambushed me on a deserted road. They dragged me from my old car, and then Vargas himself stepped out of the darkness. He wasn't just there to hurt me. He wanted to destroy my spirit. "You put your faith in dusty old papers, Father," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "But this God of yours has abandoned these people. I am their salvation now." They didn't just beat me. They had a rough, wooden crate waiting. They forced me inside, the terrified prayers dying in my throat as they nailed the lid shut. I felt the box being lowered into the ground, and the thud of dirt hitting the wood above me was the most horrifying sound I have ever heard. Just before the sounds faded, I heard Vargas whisper, "Let's see if your God can hear you from hell." As I lay there in the suffocating darkness, Vargas returned to Santa Esperanza to complete his victory. He spread a vicious, calculated rumor. Father Mateo, overcome with greed, had stolen the church's restoration fund and fled the country. He didn't just try to kill me, he murdered my reputation, shattering the town's spirit and breaking their will to resist. With me gone and my name disgraced, the town's resistance crumbled. The parishioners I had served my whole life felt betrayed and abandoned. The church, once the heart of our community, became nearly empty. Shame and despair fell over Santa Esperanza like a shroud, and Vargas moved quickly, forcing the now leaderless farmers off their land. For 3 days I lay in the dark earth, my prayers growing weaker as my hope faded into a horrifying acceptance of death. My 3rd day in the earth was the day I surrendered. The air was thick and hot, smelling of pine and my own fear. I had screamed until my throat was raw, prayed until my words felt like empty echoes in a void. In that crushing darkness, I finally believed Ricardo Vargas. God had abandoned me. He had abandoned Santa Esperanza. It's a terrible thing to lose your faith when it's all you have left. Listen to this story to the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? The splinters from the cheap wood dug into my back and shoulders with every shallow breath. I could no longer tell if it was day or night. Time had dissolved into a long, suffocating moment of pure agony. My body ached for water, and my mind began to play tricks on me, showing me memories of sunshine and open fields. I whispered a final prayer, not for rescue, but for forgiveness, and a merciful end. I was ready for death to take me. I had made my peace with the silence of heaven. But then something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a light, but a feeling, a warmth that spread through my chest, pushing back the cold despair. It felt like a gentle hand on my soul. In my mind's eye, I saw a clear image of young Miguel, my altar boy. He was a quiet orphan who saw the church as his only true home. I saw his serious, determined face, looking not at me, but up towards the heavens, as if he was arguing with God on my behalf. I would later learn that while the rest of the town mourned or cursed my name, Miguel refused to believe Vargas's lies. He was just a boy, but his faith was stronger than that of any adult in Santa Esperanza. He spent those 3 days kneeling on the cold church floor, not eating, just praying. He told the few old women who still came to light candles that Father Mateo was not a thief. He said God would not let a good man be swallowed by a lie. On the 3rd night his prayers were answered. He fell into an exhausted sleep and had a dream. In it, the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared before him, her face full of sorrow. She didn't speak a word, but she raised her hand and pointed toward the desert, to a specific spot marked by a single gnarled mesquite tree. When Miguel woke, he didn't have doubt. He had a mission. He ran to the old parishioners, his eyes blazing with a holy certainty that was impossible to deny. He told them God had shown him the way. The few loyal parishioners, led by the impossible faith of a child, pulled me from that wooden tomb. I was more a ghost than a man, caked in dirt, my body a wreck of dehydration and bruises. They carried me in secret to the small, hidden room behind the altar, the one place they knew Vargas wouldn't dare to look. For days I drifted in and out of consciousness, the world a blur of hushed voices, and the taste of water being spooned into my mouth. I had been brought back from the grave, but I soon learned that my life had been buried far deeper than my body. As strength slowly returned to my limbs, the old woman, Elena, sat by my cot and told me everything. Her words were like shovelfuls of dirt being thrown on me all over again. Vargas hadn't just left me for dead. He had meticulously executed my character. He told the town I had stolen the restoration fund, a lie so venomous and so perfectly timed that it stuck. He painted me as a hypocrite, a wolf in shepherd's clothing who had preyed on their generosity before fleeing with their money. The pain of that betrayal was 1,000 times worse than the splinters in the darkness. These were people I had baptized, whose confessions I had heard, whose hands I had held as they buried their loved ones. To hear that they now believed I was a common thief shattered something inside me. Elena told me that even my closest friends, men I had shared meals with for 20 years, now spoke my name with contempt. They had abandoned me completely, choosing the word of a rich stranger over the lifetime I had dedicated to them. My reputation, the only thing a priest truly owns, was destroyed. Vargas had poisoned the well of their faith, and I was the sickness they were told to blame. He had become their savior by making me their devil. While I was fighting for air beneath the earth, he was standing at a town meeting, feigning sadness as he announced my crime. He even promised to use his own money to, quote, make up for the church's loss, cementing his place as the town's hero. He was prospering on the ashes of my good name. From my hiding place I could sometimes hear the sounds of the town, and it was the sound of defeat. The rumbling of Vargas's bulldozers had already begun at the edge of the village, a constant, grinding reminder of his victory. The farmers, their spirit broken by my supposed betrayal, had given up the fight. They felt that if their own priest had abandoned them for money, then God himself must have turned his back on Santa Esperanza. Their land was being ripped away, and they had no will left to resist. The isolation was suffocating. I was a prisoner in my own church, hidden away like a shameful secret by the few who still believed. Young Miguel would sneak me food, his eyes full of a faith that I struggled to feel myself. But outside those stone walls, I was a pariah. I learned that my portrait, which had hung in the parish hall for 15 years, had been taken down and thrown in the trash. It was a small thing, but it felt like they were erasing my very existence. wiping away every good deed, every prayer, every moment of shared humanity. Elena recounted how people I had helped through their darkest times were now the loudest in their condemnation. A woman whose son I had counseled out of a deep depression now told everyone I was a charlatan. A man whose farm I helped save from a flood a decade ago was now the first to sign his land over to Vargas, declaring that at least Vargas was an honest devil, not a lying saint. Each story was another nail in a coffin I couldn't escape. The humiliation was a constant, bitter taste in my mouth. I had to listen as Vargas organized a community fundraiser to replace the money I had supposedly stolen. He stood in the town square, a place where I had blessed the harvest for 2 decades, and accepted the praise of the people for his generosity. He was celebrated for fixing a crime he himself had invented, a wound he had inflicted. He was thriving on my ruin, and I was powerless to stop it. My friends and family from the neighboring towns had tried to reach out, but Vargas's story was too convincing. My own sister, after hearing the news, had apparently said she was praying for my lost soul. They didn't believe I was dead, only that I was a disgrace. I was utterly alone, cut off from everyone I had ever loved, branded a sinner and a thief. The loneliness was a cold, heavy shroud that threatened to extinguish the small flame of life that remained in me. I remember one afternoon, peering through a crack in the sacristy window, I saw Vargas walking through the plaza. He was laughing, patting children on the head, shaking hands with the farmers he was about to make homeless. He looked directly at the church, and for a terrifying second, I thought his eyes met mine. He smiled, a confident, cruel smile of a man who owned the world. In that moment I felt nothing but a profound, soul-crushing defeat. He had won. The weight of it all pressed down on me. What was the point of my survival? God had allowed me to be pulled from the earth, but for what? To live as a ghost in my own home? To watch the man who tried to murder me steal the souls of my flock? Despair was a familiar darkness, and it was calling to me again, tempting me to give up, to let the lie be the final word on my life. I was not just broken. I was disintegrated. My physical recovery was slow, but the recovery of my spirit felt impossible. The few who had saved me treated me with a hushed reverence, calling my survival a miracle. But I didn't feel like a miracle. I felt like a failure, a man whose life's work had been turned to dust by a single well-told lie. I saw the hope in their eyes, but when I looked in the small, cracked mirror in my room, I saw only a hollowed-out man. One night, Elena brought me a small wooden rosary. It was crudely carved, worn smooth with use. "One of the men who buried you dropped this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It must have fallen from his pocket as they threw dirt on your coffin." I took it in my hands, the wood rough against my skin. It was a simple object, something a common man would carry. It was a piece of my own burial, a relic of my darkest hour. I stared at that rosary for what felt like hours. It was a symbol of the evil done to me. It was dropped by a hand that had helped seal me in a tomb. Yet, it was also a chain of prayers. It was an object of faith, however tarnished. Holding it, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was a cold, quiet anger, but it was different from the helpless rage I'd felt before. This was focused. It was sharp. The sight of Vargas prospering, of my people suffering under his lies, had ground me down. But this small object, this mistake left behind by my would-be killer, felt like a sign. It was an oversight. It was a loose thread in the perfect tapestry of his deception. It was a reminder that these men, for all their power and cruelty, were just men, and men make mistakes. I thought about McGill's dream, about the impossible faith that led him to a single mesquite tree in a vast desert. He hadn't despaired. He hadn't accepted the lie. He had prayed, and he had listened. His faith had been his weapon, and it had been stronger than Vargas's bulldozers and his money. I had been so focused on my own pain that I had forgotten the power of a faith that pure. That night, for the first time since my rescue, I knelt to pray. Not as a priest, but as a man pushed to the very edge of his existence. I didn't ask for comfort or for an easy path. I held the dropped rosary in my hand and I prayed for clarity. I prayed for strength. I prayed not for forgiveness for my enemies, but for the wisdom to bring them to justice. I realized then that Vargas had made a critical error. He thought that by destroying my name, he had destroyed my power. He was wrong. He had taken everything from me, my reputation, my community, my peace. But in doing so, he had left me with nothing to lose. A man with nothing to lose is a man who is finally free to fight without fear. The lie had been his most powerful weapon, but the truth was now my only one. He had built his empire in Santa Esperanza on a foundation of falsehoods, a house of cards masquerading as a fortress. All it would take was one steady hand, guided by truth, to bring the entire thing crashing down. He had buried a priest, but he had no idea what he had unearthed. My pain began to transform. It was no longer a weight pulling me down, but a fire being forged into a blade. The humiliation, the isolation, the defeat, they became the fuel. I looked at my scarred hands, still weak but now steady. I was not just a survivor, I was a witness. God had not saved me to hide in the shadows. He had saved me to be His light in the darkness. Vargas had used a lie to break the people's spirit. I would use the truth to restore it. His revenge was loud, brutal, and built on intimidation. Mine would be quiet, strategic, and built on the one thing he could never understand: faith. He had underestimated the God of Santa Esperanza, and he had certainly underestimated me. I looked again at the crude wooden rosary. It was more than a clue. It was a promise. It was a symbol of his sin, and it would become the instrument of his downfall. He had left behind the very seed of his own destruction, and I would make sure it grew into a tree of judgment that would cast a shadow over everything he had built. The fight was far from over, but in my heart it had already begun. The fear was gone, replaced by a calm, unshakable resolve. I would not let my story end in a hidden room, whispered about as a cautionary tale. My story would end in the light, in the town square, where everyone would see the truth for themselves. I finally understood my purpose. I was not just Father Mateo anymore. In the eyes of the few who knew, I was the man who had come back. My return would not be a quiet affair. It would be a resurrection, not just for me, but for the soul of the entire town. And it would begin the moment I stepped out of the shadows and back into the world that thought it had gotten rid of me. My secret weapon wasn't a hidden document or a powerful connection in the city. It was something Ricardo Vargas, in all his arrogance, could never have predicted. He thought he had buried a man, but what he had truly done was plant a seed. The story of my survival, of being pulled from the earth after 3 days, became my true power. It was a resource that couldn't be bought or stolen. It had been granted by God Himself, and it would prove to be more powerful than all of Vargas's money and all his lies. In the eyes of the few who had saved me, I was no longer just Father Mateo. I was the man who had come back. They began to call me the Resurrected in hushed, awestruck tones. The name spread quietly, from one loyal parishioner to another, a secret fire of hope being kindled in the darkness Vargas had created. My survival wasn't just a lucky break. It was seen as a divine sign, a direct answer to the prayers of a faithful child. This perception was a weapon Vargas had no defense against. Vargas had made the classic mistake of every tyrant. He underestimated the power of faith. He saw me as a simple, small-town priest, an obstacle to be removed. He thought that by destroying my reputation and my body, he would crush the town's spirit forever. It never occurred to him that the very act of trying to erase me would transform me into a symbol of hope, making me more influential in my supposed death than I ever was in life. The story of my rescue became the town's story. It was a testament that God had not abandoned Santa Esperanza. If He could reach into the earth and pull out their priest, then He could certainly save their homes. The despair that had settled over the community began to lift, replaced by a cautious but powerful sense of wonder. Hope, a resource Vargas had systematically destroyed, was now growing back from the very grave he had dug for me. The miracle was anchored in the purity of young Miguel. His vision of the Virgin of Guadalupe wasn't just a child's dream. It was a holy directive that the people could believe in. It wasn't my word against Vargas's. It was God's intervention, witnessed through the eyes of an innocent. This made the story untouchable, sacred. It transformed a crime into a parable, and I was at the center of it. The faith of my people, once shaken and poisoned by Vargas's lies, was now being reforged into something stronger. It was no longer a passive belief, but an active, fiery conviction. They had seen a miracle with their own eyes. They had touched the dirt that had held me. They had seen the splinters from my wooden tomb. Their faith was now a shield, and soon I would show them how to make it a sword. When I finally regained enough strength to speak to the small group hiding me, I could feel the change. My voice, though weak, carried a new authority. It was the voice of a man who had been to the edge of death and back. They listened not just to a priest giving a sermon, but to a witness sharing a testimony. Every word I spoke was amplified by the miracle of my presence. All the while, Vargas remained blissfully ignorant. He was too busy consolidating his power, basking in the false gratitude of the townspeople he was deceiving. In his mind, I was a finished chapter, a ghost who no longer mattered. He never imagined that while his bulldozers were tearing up the earth on the edge of town, a force was gathering within the stone walls of the church that would tear down his entire empire. He had fought with the weapons of this world: money, lies, and brute force. My weapon was different. It was the undeniable truth of my survival, powered by the renewed faith of my flock. It was a spiritual force that operated on a plane he couldn't even perceive, let alone fight. He was playing checkers while God had just taught me how to play chess. And then there was the rosary. That small, crudely carved object was the physical link between my miracle and his crime. It was tangible proof that one of his men had been there, a careless mistake that tied his evil act to the holy story of my return. It was no longer just a symbol of my burial. It was the key that would unlock his downfall. It was a holy relic of his sin. I began to see my ordeal not as a tragedy, but as a preparation. God had allowed me to be pushed into the darkness so I could understand the true nature of the light. The humiliation, the pain, the despair, it had all been a trial by fire, forging me from a simple priest into a vessel for his justice. I was no longer a victim, I was his instrument. The path forward became clear. My revenge would not be one of violence or hatred. That was Vargas's way. Mine would be a revenge of revelation. I would use the truth, amplified by the miracle of my survival, to expose his darkness. He had built his kingdom on a foundation of lies, and I would bring it all crashing down simply by standing in the light. Vargas's greatest asset was now his most glaring vulnerability. He had wrapped himself in the cloak of a pious, God-fearing benefactor. He attended every service, donated generously, and spoke of faith at every opportunity. He had built his public image on a lie, and I was the living, breathing proof of that lie. He had unwittingly handed me the perfect tool to dismantle him piece by piece. He thought he had silenced me forever, but he had only given me a more powerful voice. He thought he had buried me, but he had only planted me where I could grow into something he could not control. He was a man who believed only in what he could see and touch, and he was about to be destroyed by the power of the unseen. Hiding in that sacristy, I was no longer the broken man who had been pulled from the earth. I was a strategist, a soldier in a holy war. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calm certainty. Vargas had tried to write the end of my story, but he had no idea that God had just given me a new beginning. The stage was set for a resurrection, not just of a man, but of an entire town's soul. Before I reveal how the revenge took place, it's very important that you subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video, so that YouTube recommends this incredible story to more people. This way, you help us spread the gospel through real-life testimonies. So please, help us in this noble cause. The day of the investors' final visit arrived, a date Ricardo Vargas had marked for his ultimate triumph. He had organized a grand signing ceremony in the town hall, a media event to broadcast the birth of his new empire. The air was thick with a strange tension, a mix of his manufactured excitement and the town's quiet, watchful anticipation. I felt no rage, no desire for a bloody confrontation. I felt a profound calm, the serenity of a man who knows he is an instrument of a will far greater than his own. God had given me the stage, and I was ready to play my part. The hall was filled with important people, a sea of expensive suits and polite smiles. Cameras flashed as Vargas stood at a podium speaking eloquently about progress, community, and, of course, faith. He was a master performer, weaving a tale of salvation for Santa Esperanza. As he spoke, I entered from the back of the hall. I wasn't alone. Behind me, silent and solemn, walked Miguel, Elena, and the dozens of parishioners who had kept the faith. We were not a mob. We were a congregation, and our quiet procession parted the crowd like the Red Sea. I walked all the way to the foot of the stage, waiting for him to finish his sentence. The cameras turned to me, the miracle priest, making an unexpected appearance. Vargas faltered, his confident smile tightening at the edges. I met his gaze, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. I held up my hand, not in anger, but to show him the small, crudely carved wooden rosary that rested in my palm. "Mr. Vargas," I said, my voice steady and clear, amplified by the microphones. "You spoke of faith. When I was in the darkness, I lost everything. Except for this." A hush fell over the room. I let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "One of the men who buried me dropped this in the dirt." I explained, my eyes never leaving his. "It must have fallen from his pocket as he worked." I then turned my gaze to the crowd, to the investors, to the cameras. "It has a unique design. I should know. I carved it myself, years ago, as part of a matching set for a man who swore he would always protect this town and its people. A man I once considered a friend." Then, I did the last thing he expected. I walked up the steps of the stage and offered the rosary to him, holding it out in my open palm. "I believe this belongs to you," I said softly. The main news camera, broadcasting live, zoomed in on our hands. And there, for the entire world to see, dangling from Ricardo Vargas's wrist, was the other half of the rosary, a bracelet with the exact same crude carving, and the telltale broken link where the other piece had snapped off. It was his signature accessory, something everyone in town had seen 1,000 times. The reaction was not a shout, but a single, collective gasp that sucked the air out of the room. The investors stood up, their faces masks of horror and disgust. My people didn't need to hear a confession. They saw the truth in that perfectly matched broken piece of wood. In that one, silent, televised moment, Vargas was not just exposed. He was spiritually annihilated. His pious facade shattered into a million pieces, revealing the monster underneath. His empire, built on a mountain of lies, had just been brought down by a single humble seed of truth. I didn't wait to see the full extent of the chaos. My work was done. As the investors stormed out and reporters began shouting questions, I turned my back on the man who was now utterly alone on his stage. I walked down the steps, placed my hand on young Miguel's shoulder, and led my flock out of the hall and back into the sunlight. There was no cheering, no celebration. There was only a quiet, profound sense of justice, as calm and as powerful as a prayer finally answered. He had been left to the judgment of the world, but I had reclaimed my soul and the soul of my town.